All right, today's lecture is on yellow journalism, how yellow journalism leads to the Spanish-American War. All right, so let's start our notes. Also, while we're on YouTube, this is our first video. Also, big thanks to Jorge for helping help record this. So let's begin. First off, we're going to begin with yellow journalism, what yellow journalism is, and how this leads to the Spanish-American War. First off, the Spanish-American War is often referred to as the first media war. What does that mean? We're talking about the Spanish-American War being the first media war. This will be the first war where there's actually journalists covering the war. That means like journalists, people writing about it for newspapers who are fairly close to the action, where the guns are being fired and everything, and they're actually covering it. Now, I'm going to take you back to the beginning for your paper here. We're going to talk about yellow journalism, what yellow journalism is, and who this guy, the yellow kid, is. Well, first off, the definition of yellow journalism is basically journalism that exaggerates stories. It's not so much going for the truth. I mean, they'll publish the story and the event happened, but they'll exaggerate it and they'll make it, they'll make it more than what it is. Now, the Yellow Kid, who we have right here, the Yellow Kid was a comic that appeared in newspapers in the late 1890s. Now, the significance of the Yellow Kid, as we'll talk about, is the newspapers were called yellow journalism. They were actually called that because these newspapers had the Yellow Kid in them, and he was wearing yellow. So that's why they got the name, the yellow journalism. So who is the Yellow Kid? Well, the Yellow Kid is, actually, he's supposed to be an Irish immigrant who was living in New York. Now, he's a comic, so obviously not a real person. But what it was is, at this time, there was a comic that came out called Hogan's Alley. Hogan's Alley started in a newspaper called the New York World. So Hogan's Alley was a comic that had a Yellow Kid. It started out in a newspaper called the New York World. Now, in these comic books, there would be the Yellow Kid. It was meant for comedy. But also, it really negatively showed scenes of ethnic neighborhoods of New York at that time that had a lot of immigration. Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants. And what I'm going to show you here quick is a video from YouTube. Now, this video shows some scenes from what it was like, what the Yellow Kid comics were actually like. So, when you look on here, these were the actual comics of that time of the Yellow Kid. Now, here he was here. He'd always have something written on his shirt. The spelling would be incorrect. It was also kind of making fun of low education of that time of the area. And if you look at these, there are a lot of stereotypical images you will find. I'm going to show one in particular where it shows an African American in the Yellow Kid. Coming up here pretty quick. Even used to sell cigarettes, as you see right there. So this would be the Yellow Kid, and he started off in the New York World. Now here you see obviously a scene from New York, busy, crowded. There's the Yellow Kid. Now, why is he wearing yellow, and why is his head shaved? His head is shaved because often immigrants at that time, there was a big fear of like lice. Many people at this time, the conditions that the immigrants had to live in were very dirty, were very unclean. It's because they were very poor living conditions. If you go back to when we were talking about Rockefeller, Carnegie, and the immigrants who were working for them and other big companies, they weren't paid very much, and they were forced to live in very unsanitary conditions. So the Yellow Kid, his head was shaven. Oftentimes that was done to kids in these neighborhoods because of lice. And the yellow shirt was put on because they were actually, lack of a better term, almost like desanitized, like the gloves put on them to make sure that they were clean. So, the Yellow Kid starts off in the New York World. He's then lured away, and he goes to the New York Journal. So the cartoonist who wrote the Yellow Kid, here we have another depiction I'm going to go back there and show you of a racial stereotype of the time with African Americans. Right there. So the Yellow Kid, the cartoonist, was paid more to go to the New York Journal. And two newspapers this time you're going to need to know, the New York World and the New York Journal. He's paid more to go for the New York Journal. Now if we look here, you can see the racial stereotype images of this time of the yellow kid. I mean, who do you have here? Who's he fighting in this cartoon?
Black guy.
A black guy, or an African American, who again, stereotypically almost even looks like an ape or a monkey at this point. I mean, you look at him as a stereotypical image. I have no idea why this goat comes into the picture at all. But this is a comic of the yellow kid of this time. Again, late 1890s, early 1900s is our time period. Now, in response, the New York World, they lost their cartoonist to the yellow kid. He went to the New York Journal. But they ended up hiring another cartoonist to draw the same comic. So both the New York World and New York Journal had the yellow kid comics, both of them, at this time. And we'll go back to the PowerPoint here. So, other things you're going to need to know about yellow journalism this time. The two newspapers that had stories with yellow journalism, which again was exaggerated stories of this time. Two people you need to know is William Randolph Hearst. William Randolph Hearst, who we'll talk about more. William Randolph Hearst, his paper is the New York Journal. William Randolph Hearst, New York Journal. The New York World, that newspaper is owned by a man named Joseph Pulitzer. So both these guys own these newspapers, and again, they printed pretty exaggerated stories. These were the first newspapers that had like really big headlines on the cover. And we're going to discover as we go here, these newspapers are going to end up help leading America into fighting the Spanish-American War. All right, so let's move on. And now we're moving on to Cuba. So, Cuba. Now again, around this time period, we're going at the end of the 1800s. At the end of the 1800s, Spain still owns Cuba. At the end of the 1800s, Spain still owns Cuba. So, Spain was a global power in the 1500s. So in the 1500s, Spain was a global power. So if we look at this around the 1500s, Spain is a big global power. This is shortly after Columbus, Hernando Cortez comes into Mexico, Pizarro comes into South America, to Peru. 1500s, Spain's a big deal. They're the most powerful nation in the world for a long time. But by the time we get to the 1890s, where we are now in our class, in the 1890s, Spain is no longer anywhere near as powerful. You want to think of it this way. In the 1500s, Spain would have been like, a big Hollywood star. They would have been the big deal. 1500s, Spain's the big deal. They're the big Hollywood star. 1890s, Spain's on Dancing with the Stars. They're kind of washed up. They're no longer what they used to be. They're kind of living off their name. Another way of thinking about it, a quote like this has been said before, Spain in the 1890s is like an aging actress still trying to get a free dinner off her looks. So, they used to be big and powerful, but they're not that much of a big deal anymore. Now, if you think about what Spain used to own, they used to own almost all of Latin America with the exception of Brazil and a few other smaller countries, South America and the Caribbean. Now if we look at them in the 1890s, all Spain has left for their former colonies is the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. That's all they got left. So in the 1500s, they had this huge empire, all of Mexico, all of Ecuador, other parts of South America, Central America, islands. I mean, it's the reason why, if you're a Cristo Rey, many of our students, why do you speak Spanish? Well, it's because your ancestors were taken over by the Spanish, and it's part of your ancestry. Same reason why America's taken over by the English, you speak English. Canada, part of it English, part of it taken over by the French. The conquerors usually make the people speak their language. So, 1890s, we got Spain and Cuba. But Cuba is fighting for independence, like many of the Latin American countries got in the 1800s, all the way from Chile up to Mexico. So the Cubans don't want to be under the Spanish rule. So many of them go to the big, strong nearby country, the United States. And if, you know, geography, you got Cuba. How many miles away from America's Cuba? 90 miles, about. So if you got Florida and Cuba are only about 90 miles away. Spain is all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. So the Cubans, many of them who don't want to live under Spanish rule, they come to America. One of our guys right here, Jose Marti, he was a Cuban. He was actually exiled, which means he had to go. And he went to go live in America. He lived in New York. He lived in Tampa for a while. But he was a writer. He wanted to be free from Cuba. He went in exile. He's an example of one of the Cubans who left, one of the leaders. He actually goes back to fight in the revolution and is killed. So, Cubans, they're rebelling. They're fighting back against Spain. Spain doesn't like this. So what does Spain do? I'm probably going to say his name wrong here, but Spain sends General Weyler. Weyler? I'll get that right eventually. General Weyler was sent into Cuba, basically to calm it down, to stop the unrest. So General Weyler comes into Cuba basically to stop the fighting. He's given the title of, he's the governor of Cuba. So, his hope is he wants to crush the rebellion army. They're called the Cuban Liberation Army. He wants to crush the Cuban Liberation Army and bring back order, bring back Spanish order to Cuba. Now, he's attempting to serve his country and win the war. So, his plan he has is called the Reconstruction Plan. General Weyler has what's called the Reconstruction Plan. He's trying to bring back in the Cubans. His way of doing this his Reconstruction Plan means he's going to build what are called actually re-concentration camps. Re-concentration camps. What does that sound a lot like?
Like the war in, what is it?
World War II?
Yeah.
Concentration camps?
Yeah. What's it called?
Oh, concentration camps, Holocaust?
Holocaust.
Yep. Possible 3.5, 4.0 option for this paper is to compare the re-concentration camps to the concentration camps. They were definitely different, but there were some similarities. Now, for the re-concentration camps, basically General Weyler is trying to round up all the rebels. He's trying to round up the rebels and put them in camps, which are basically like big prisons, where thousands and thousands of Cubans end up dying. In fact, over 300,000 Cubans die in these re-concentration camps. So, Spain definitely is doing a lot of horrible things to the Cubans at this time. Now, so they're put into these re-concentration camps. Now, the problem is when you're trying to find like the rebels and you're in their country and you're not from there, are you always going to be right when you're trying to find the rebels or the insurgents, or are you going to make some mistakes probably? You know, even Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan have had this problem. How do you find the rebels? How do you find the insurgents? It's not easy to do. There's a problem for America in Vietnam too. How do you find the rebel army when they can mix in to the regular population? And maybe if you arrest someone who's not a rebel and you put him in a re-concentration camp, maybe he's a rebel now. Or maybe his brother, uncle, and father are rebels now. So a lot of times when nations do things, sometimes it can work and put down a rebellion, but sometimes it causes just more rebellion and more fighting, and it causes people to hate you even more. So, the goal of these re-concentration camps was to keep them, Cubans, alive and protected until the rebels were defeated, was to keep them protected, but it really didn't do it. Over 300,000 people die of diseases and malnutrition in these camps, which further enrages the Cubans at the Spanish. So, if we look on here, look at the picture, there's a cartoon of this time. How does America see